Marion County, Kansas, August 1891. The sun was a hammer on the anvil of the prairie, beating the air into a shimmering haze. Most men were in the shade of their barns, mending harness or sharpening blades, waiting for the heat to break. But not Wilhelm Funk. He was out in the full glare of it, wrestling with a bundle of green cottonwood saplings he'd cut from the creek bottom. He was soaking them in a long trough he dug and lined with clay, then bending them, one by one, over a circle he'd scribed in the baked earth. The circle itself was an offense. Houses in Marion County were square. They were built of sod cut from the plains or logs hauled from farther east. They had 4 corners, straight walls, and pitched roofs to shed the snow. They were sensible. Wilhelm Funk's project was not. Lloyd Stovall, the livestock commission agent, pulled his buggy to a stop on the rutted track that passed Funk's quarter section. Stovall was a man whose prosperity was built on straight lines and right angles, fence lines, property deeds, columns in a ledger. He looked at the slowly forming wooden basket on the ground and shook his head. With him was Jedediah Croft, the county's best carpenter, a man who could join 2 beams so perfectly you'd think they'd grown that way. "What in God's name is the German building now, Jedediah?" Stovall asked, not bothering to lower his voice. "Looks like a big bird cage to me, Lloyd," Croft said, a smile cracking his dry lips. "Maybe he aims to catch the crows before they get his corn." Wilhelm heard them. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a thick forearm. He was not a large man, but he was dense, with a quiet, rooted strength that came from a life of hard, methodical work. He gave a slight nod. "Mr. Stovall." "Mr. Croft?" "Funk," Stovall called out, his voice thick with the easy authority of a successful man. "Winter's coming. The ground will be frozen solid in 4 months. Are you planning to live in that basket?" "It will be a house," Wilhelm said, his English careful and accented. He turned back to his work, taking another sapling from the trough and beginning the slow, steady process of bending it into the lattice. Another neighbor, Silas Blackwood, rode up on his plow horse, his face a mask of weary curiosity. "Heard you were building a tent, Wilhelm. Didn't figure it'd be a wooden one." The word spread from there. It became the talk of the small community, the German's folly, the roundhouse, the wool tent. Stovall, holding court at the auction yard in Hillsboro a week later, delivered the final damning verdict to a group of nodding farmers and ranchers. "Mark my words," he declared, gesturing vaguely west toward Funk's land. "That tent house will be flat by the first norther. He's building a tomb. We'll find him and his family come spring, camped under a frozen hide for the rest of the winter, if they're lucky." The men around him chuckled. It was a harsh joke, but the prairie was a harsh place. They saw a man ignoring the hard-won wisdom of a generation, and they saw a fool. They saw a man building a strange, flimsy thing of sticks and wool to face a Kansas winter, a winter that could crack oak trees and freeze a man's breath in his lungs. They thought he was mad. What did this Volga German felt maker understand about the physics of convection that the most experienced carpenters and settlers in Kansas had missed? Before we see how this strange roundhouse performed in the crucible of a plains blizzard, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We dig into these lost histories of frontier ingenuity every week, and I promise you will learn something about the hidden science of survival that you won't find anywhere else. Let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional but effective solution to a problem you've ever seen? Wilhelm Funk was not a carpenter. He had never framed a wall, pitched a roof, or mortared a chimney in his life. He was not a farmer in the Kansas sense, accustomed to the deep black soil and the vast open horizon. He was a fildsmaker, a felt maker. He had been born and raised on the Malachna steppe in what is now Ukraine, a place just as flat and unforgiving as Kansas, but with its own ancient rhythms. His hands didn't know the feel of a saw or a plane. They knew the feel of raw sheep's wool, of hot water and soap, of the pressure and rolling that transformed a loose mass of fiber into a dense, interlocking fabric that could turn wind and water. He knew the smell of lanolin, the weight of a wet bolt of felt, the precise moment when the fibers had married and would never again come apart. His people, the Volga German Mennonites, had been invited to Russia by Catherine the Great, promised land and freedom from military service. For a century they had farmed the steppes, but a new Tsar had broken that promise. Like thousands of his brethren, Wilhelm had sold what he could, packed his family, and journeyed to America, to the promise of Kansas. He brought with him his wife Anneliese, a woman as quiet and resilient as he was, and their 2 children, 10-year-old Jacob and 6-year-old Liesel. He also brought the memory of the Kazakhs, the nomadic people who roamed the steppes to the east. As a boy, he had traveled with his father on wool-buying trips, and he'd seen their dwellings, the gurs or yurts. He'd watched them disappear over the horizon in the morning and reappear as a small village in a new valley by evening. He had been inside them, felt the astonishing stillness and warmth they held against a shrieking steppe wind, a wind that carried the same bite as the wind in Kansas. He saw how the round shapes spilled the gale, how the thick felt walls drank the cold. It was a memory filed away, a piece of practical knowledge from another world. Then came their first winter in Kansas, in 1890. They had arrived too late to build properly, and had spent their savings on land and seed wheat. They moved into a hastily constructed soddy, little more than a dugout with a plank roof. It was a miserable existence, a master class in the physics of cold. That was the winter Wilhelm learned about the cruelty of the American plains. He learned that whiskey left in the unheated part of the cabin could thicken to a syrup in its bottle overnight. He saw the window putty his neighbor had so carefully applied crumble out of the frames like dry cornbread, letting the wind shriek through the gaps. He experienced the morning he went to harness the horse, and the cold steel of the bridle bit froze instantly to the animal's tongue, tearing the skin when it flinched. Inside the soddy, life was a constant battle. A curtain of ice, thick as his thumb, grew down the walls. Anneliese and the children rarely took off their coats. They lived in a tiny bubble of warmth around the small iron stove, a bubble that shrank the moment the fire died down. They burned through their woodpile at an alarming rate, yet the cold was never truly gone. It was always there, waiting in the corners, creeping across the floor. Liesel developed a cough that rattled in her small chest for 2 months. Wilhelm swore he would not let his family endure another winter like that. He would not fight the Kansas wind with the square, brittle methods of this new land. He would fight it with the yielding, enveloping wisdom of the old one. The failure of the conventional frontier cabin wasn't a mystery of malice, but a simple, brutal equation of physics. The problem wasn't the cold, precisely. The problem was air, specifically moving air. Heat's greatest enemy is convection, the process by which heat is transferred by the movement of a fluid, in this case, the air inside a house. A standard square cabin, whether of log or sod, is a perfect engine for convection. The stove heats the air in the center of the room. This warm, less dense air rises to the ceiling. As it moves toward the outer walls, it cools rapidly, becoming denser. It then sinks, sliding down the cold plank or sod walls. When it reaches the floor, it is pulled back toward the stove to be reheated, completing the cycle. This creates a constant, imperceptible draft. Your head might be warm, but your feet are always cold. The corners were the real villains. In the 90-degree angle of a corner, this descending cold air would pool and eddy, creating a persistent zone of frigid temperature that no stove could seem to defeat. It was why furniture was always pulled away from the walls, why beds were piled high with quilts. The settlers were living in the middle of a thermal vortex of their own making. Jedediah Croft could build the tightest-seamed cabin in the county, but he couldn't change the geometry of the air inside it. The walls themselves were conduits for heat loss. A solid foot of packed sod or a 6-inch log has some insulating value, but it is solid. Heat conducts through a solid material directly. The warmth inside simply bled through the walls into the frozen world outside, a constant losing battle that could only be fought with more fuel. For families like the Blackwoods, this meant a winter spent in a state of siege, constantly feeding the stove, stuffing rags into every new crack that appeared, and still waking to frost on their blankets. The cabin was a fortress with porous walls, and the enemy was already inside, circulating in the corners. Wilhelm Funk understood this. He knew you couldn't defeat the cold by building a better box. You had to build something that wasn't a box at all. The construction began in late August and became a daily spectacle. First, the frame. Wilhelm laid out the 22-foot circle and drove 60 stakes into the ground. The cottonwood saplings, now pliable from their long soak, were bent and lashed with rawhide strips to form a circular lattice wall about 5 feet high. This was the khana. Then came the roof poles, another 60 saplings, each one straightened at the bottom and tapered at the top. He lifted them one by one, resting the straight end in the V-notch of the lattice wall and fitting the tapered end into the openings of a heavy wooden ring, the tuno, or crown. As more poles were added, they pushed outward on the walls and downward on the crown, creating a structure held together by its own balanced tension. It was a dome of pure compression and tension, without a single nail or peg. Jedediah Croft came by again, this time alone. He walked the perimeter, running a hand over the joints. It's clever, I'll give you that, Funk, but it has no sheer strength. A 40-mile-an-hour gust from the north will fold it like a fan. It will bend, Wilhelm said quietly, not looking up from his lashing. It will not break. Next came the felt, Wilhelm's true area of expertise. He had spent the summer buying and processing raw fleece from his Mennonite neighbors. He and Annalise worked for weeks, carding the wool, layering it on large canvases, soaking it with hot, soapy water, and then rolling it, compressing it, beating it. They made 5 massive circular sheets of felt, each one progressively thicker, the innermost a half-inch thick, the outermost a full 3 inches. They hoisted the layers over the wooden frame, one at a time. It was a monumental task. The wet felt was immensely heavy. Jakob, his young face set with determination, helped pull the ropes. Annalise, on a ladder, guided the heavy sheets into place. Each layer was stretched taut and tied down, overlapping the one below. The final thickness was a solid 8 inches of dense wool felt. "He's wrapping his birdcage in blankets," Stovall scoffed to the postmaster. "He's gone completely mad. That wool will soak up the first freezing rain, and the weight of the ice will crush them in their sleep." Wilhelm heard the talk. He knew what they were saying. Annalise heard it too. One evening, as they sat outside the nearly finished structure, she touched his arm. "They think we are building our own grave, Wilhelm." "This is not a grave, Annalise," he said, looking at the smooth, curved shape that stood on the prairie like a great, gray mushroom. "This is a lung. It will breathe. It will hold the warmth like a sleeping animal." The final layer was a skin of oiled cowhides, stitched together and stretched over the felt, creating a waterproof, windproof membrane. A small tin chimney pipe was fitted through the crown, carefully insulated from the wood and felt. A heavy wooden door, The only truly square thing in the entire structure was set into the frame. By late October, it was done. From the outside, it looked alien, a piece of the steppe dropped onto the Kansas grid. Inside, it was a single, vast, circular room, the lattice of the walls and the spokes of the roof creating a beautiful, complex pattern. It smelled of wool, wood, and oil. It was quiet, utterly quiet. The science behind Wilhelm Funk's felt house was an elegant rebuttal to the brute force of the square cabin. It centered on two principles: the suppression of convection and the power of trapped air. First, the shape. In a round room, the convection cycle that plagued square cabins is fundamentally broken. There are no 90-degree corners for cold air to pool in. As the warm air from the central stove rises and moves toward the walls, it cools and descends, but it does so along a smooth, continuous curve. The air slides gently down the wall and is drawn back toward the stove in a slow, circular pattern. A gentle swirl, not a turbulent vortex. This massively reduces internal drafts and creates a far more uniform temperature from floor to ceiling. The entire volume of the room becomes usable living space, not just the small island of heat around the stove. Second, and more importantly, was the felt. A solid material, like a log, conducts heat in a straight line. The energy simply passes from molecule to molecule, from the warm interior to the cold exterior. But Wilhelm's wall wasn't a solid, it was a matrix. Pressed wool, felt on a microscopic level, is a chaotic web of interlocking fibers. The genius of it is not the wool itself, but the air trapped between the fibers. Air is a terrible conductor of heat. By creating 5 separate layers of felt, Wilhelm created not just one insulating barrier, but 5, with thin layers of air trapped between the great sheets themselves. Think of it in terms of British thermal units, or BTUs, the amount of energy needed to raise 1 pound of water by 1 degree Fahrenheit. A typical 6-inch log wall might lose 300 BTUs per hour per square foot in a brutal wind. Wilhelm's 8-inch 5-layer felt wall, with its more than 30 dead air pockets per cubic foot, lost less than 50. The heat generated by his small stove wasn't constantly battling to replace warmth that was hemorrhaging through the walls. Instead, the heat was captured, held, and reflected back into the living space by the millions upon millions of tiny air pockets. Each pocket was a microscopic break in the chain of heat loss, a tiny dam slowing the river of escaping energy to a trickle. The felt didn't just block the cold. It broke the process of heat transfer into millions of tiny, failed attempts. It was a defense in depth, a quiet, cellular shield that the simple, solid log wall could never match. The winter of 1891 arrived not with a gentle drift of snow, but with a roar. On the 3rd day of December, the sky to the northwest turned a bruised, slate-blue color. The air grew still and heavy. The temperature at noon was a mild 38 degrees Fahrenheit. By sunset 6 hours later, it was 31 degrees below zero. The blue norther had arrived. With the temperature drop came the wind. It was not a gusting wind, but a solid, unyielding river of Arctic air, a steady 40 miles per hour out of the north that did not slacken for 4 days. The wind chill dropped to a level that was not just dangerous, but actively malevolent. A physical force that sought out every crack, every weakness, every flaw in a man's defenses. In Silas Blackwood's cabin, the fight for survival was desperate. The wind drove fine, powdery snow through the door jambs and window frames, creating small drifts on the floor. The family huddled around the stove, which glowed a dull red, devouring the precious woodpile. The noise was deafening. The shriek of the wind, the rattle of the windows, the groan of the timbers. Every hour, Silas had to take a burning stick and thaw the ice that sealed the door shut, just in case they needed to escape. His wife, Martha, spent her time stuffing more rags and corn husks into the walls, a futile gesture against an invisible, unstoppable tide. Inside Wilhelm Funk's roundhouse, there was silence. The wind hit the curved walls and flowed around them, unable to find a corner to grip, a flat surface to punish. The sound was not a shriek, but a low, deep hum, like a distant river. The 8 inches of felt absorbed the vibration, deadening it. Inside, the air was still. A single candle flame on the small table burned straight up, its flame unwavering. The contrast was stark and measurable. Outside, the official temperature held at a steady 38 Auestig for 3 straight nights. Inside the Blackwood cabin, the temperature 3 feet from the stove was 50 degrees, while in the corners, water froze solid in its bucket. They were living in a thermal war zone. Inside Wilhelm's home, a single small fire in the stove kept the entire 22-foot diameter space at a comfortable 65 degrees. Jacob and Liesel, in their shirt sleeves, played a game with dried corn kernels on a blanket spread on the floor. Anneliese was kneading dough for bread on the table, the warmth of the room helping the yeast to rise. There was no ice on the walls. There were no drafts on the floor. The cold was not a presence to be fought. It was simply a condition that existed somewhere else, on the other side of the wool. The domestic warmth was proven by a simple, profound fact. The crock of milk set out for the next day's butter churning hadn't even formed a skin of ice. It was just milk. They were just living. Half a mile to the east, a Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific section hand crew was stranded. Their work train, a small engine, and a single open-topped gondola car carrying tools and supplies had been caught by the storm. Drifts had buried the track ahead and behind. They had shoveled their coal into a makeshift brazier in the middle of the gondola and huddled around it, wrapped in every piece of canvas and clothing they had. Their foreman, a tough Irishman named O'Malley, was worried. They had food, but the cold was relentless. It leached the strength from a man. On the second night of the storm, as O'Malley scanned the bleak, moonlit landscape of snow, he saw something odd. Out on the prairie, where he knew the new German family lived, was a low, gray shape. It was faintly luminous in the moonlight, shedding the blowing snow from its curved roof. What was truly strange was what he didn't see. He saw no frantic plume of smoke pouring from a chimney. From every other homesteader's cabin, even from a mile away, you could see the desperate, thick column of wood smoke, a sign of a stove being fed constantly. From the round shape, there was only a thin, almost invisible wisp of haze that vanished instantly in the wind. It looked warm. It looked impossibly, serenely warm. Curiosity and concern gnawed at him. On the third day, the wind slackened just enough for a man to stand. "I'm going to check on the Germans," O'Malley announced to his crew. "Something's not right over there." He pulled his coat tight, wrapped his face in wool, and began the long, brutal walk, following the line of the cinder rail bed. The journey was a battle. The wind stole his breath and burned his exposed skin. When he finally reached the strange dwelling, he was half frozen and gasping. He hammered on the solid wooden door. It swung open, and O'Malley was hit not by a gust of frigid air, but by a soft, silent wave of warmth. It was like stepping into a different season. A man with a calm face and a thick mustache stood before him. Inside, O'Malley could see a woman and 2 children, none of them wearing coats. The air smelled of baking bread. He stared, speechless. "You are cold?" Wilhelm Funk said simply. "Come in." O'Malley stumbled inside, pulling off his frozen gloves, his mind struggling to reconcile the hell he had just walked through with the peace inside this room. He sent one of his younger crewmen back to the rail yard in Hillsborough with a message. The man was to find Lloyd Stovall. The commission agent had livestock in the rail yard pens, and O'Malley knew some had already frozen to death standing up. The message was simple. Come to the Funk place. You need to see this." Stovall arrived an hour later, his face a mask of anger and frostbite. He'd lost 3 steers and was blaming the world. He stomped up to the roundhouse, ready to unleash his fury on the fool who had built it. He threw the door open, expecting to find a shivering, miserable family, a confirmation of his own grim predictions. The vindication was not an argument. It was a physical sensation. Stovall had braced himself for the familiar shock of a homesteader's cabin in deep winter. A blast of cold air from the floor, the damp chill of iced-over walls. He expected misery. What he felt instead was a gentle, even warmth that wrapped around him like a blanket. He stopped dead in the doorway, his angry words dying in his throat. His bare hand, which he'd pulled from his glove to work the latch, was met not by freezing drafts, but by air that felt like a calm September evening. Wilhelm gestured for him to come in. Stovall stepped inside, his boots making soft sounds on the wooden floor. His eyes darted around the room, trying to find the trick. He saw the small stove, barely seeming to work. He saw the children playing. He saw the candle flame, perfectly still. He walked toward the wall, the source of his ridicule, and placed his palm flat against the stretched inner canvas. He expected to feel a deep, penetrating cold, the signature of a failing wall. He felt nothing. It was neutral, almost warm to the touch. The cold had been so thoroughly defeated it didn't even register. Annalise, seeing the disbelief on his face, gestured to a small shelf near the wall. On it sat a large stoneware crock covered with a cloth. "The sauerkraut," she said softly. Stovall looked closer. The surface of the brine inside the crock was not still. It was alive. Tiny bubbles were steadily rising to the surface, a sign of the slow, gentle fermentation that requires a constant temperature well above freezing. Every crock of kraut in every other house in Marion County was a solid puck of ice, needing a hammer to break a piece off for dinner. This kraut was softly, quietly, miraculously bubbling. The sight of it broke him. It was such a small, domestic detail, yet it was more powerful than any argument. It was proof of a victory so total, so absolute, that the normal functions of life, even the life of bacteria in a crock, could continue, oblivious to the Arctic fury raging just inches away. Stovall turned to Wilhelm, his face drained of its arrogant certainty, replaced by a profound, humbled awe. He struggled for words, looking from the kraut to the placid face of the German felt maker. "My God, Funk," Stovall finally whispered, his voice cracking. "You didn't build a house. You built a summer afternoon." When the blue norther finally broke and the great thaw began, the story was carried on the meltwater. It wasn't Wilhelm who told it. It was O'Malley, the railroad foreman, and more importantly, Lloyd Stovall. The commission agent, once the loudest critic, became the most fervent advocate. At the next livestock auction, he didn't mock the tent house. He described it with the reverence of a convert. He told the story of the bubbling sauerkraut until it became a local legend. That spring, the trickle of curious neighbors became a steady stream. They came to see, to touch the walls, to stand inside and feel the impossible stillness. Wilhelm, a man of few words, answered their questions, not with lectures, but with simple demonstrations. He showed them how the saplings were joined, how the felt was layered, how the crown ring distributed the weight. He held nothing back. In July, a well-dressed man in a buggy arrived. He introduced himself as a commission drummer for the Sears, Roebuck, and Comers out of Chicago, routing through the new settlements. He'd heard the story from a grain merchant in Hillsboro, and smelling an opportunity, came to see for himself. He spent a whole day with Wilhelm, sketching the frame on a notepad, meticulously recording the dimensions, the number of poles, the angles. He called it a marvel of practical engineering. By that autumn, the idea had a new name and a wider audience. A Wichita dealer, specializing in farm implements and supplies for the Mennonite communities, began marketing prefabricated kits. They weren't called yurts, they were called winter range cottages. The advertisements featured a drawing of the roundhouse and quoted astonishing fuel savings, up to 75% less wood burned than a conventional cabin. By the fall of 1892, more than a dozen of the structures had been erected in the German-speaking settlements around Goosel, Buhler, and Hillsborough. The idea, born on the Molokna steppe and tested in a Kansas blizzard, was beginning to spread. The principles Wilhelm Funck deployed in his wool house were not magic. They were simply sound thermodynamics, a century ahead of their time. What he built on the prairie in 1891 was a primitive but exceptionally effective version of what modern building science calls a high-performance envelope. The oiled hide was an air and moisture barrier. The thick, multi-layered felt was a form of continuous exterior insulation, preventing the phenomenon of thermal bridging, where heat is conducted through the wooden frame members. His round design, which so elegantly defeated the convective loop, anticipated the efficiency of modern structures like geodesic domes. He didn't have the vocabulary of BTUs and R values, but he had a deep, intuitive understanding of the principles, learned not from books, but from observing a solution that had been perfected over 1,000 years of survival on the Eurasian steppe. There is a profound lesson in the smooth, curved walls of Wilhelm Funck's house. The other settlers in Marion County saw the Kansas wind as an enemy to be fought, a force to be resisted with thick walls and square, defiant corners. Their cabins were expressions of brute force, fortresses built to withstand a siege. But a fortress is defined by its opposition to the force outside. It is a relationship of perpetual conflict, and it is exhausting. It requires a constant fire, a constant vigilance against the cold that is always pressing in, always seeking a new crack. Wilhelm's approach was different. It was born from a different philosophy. He wasn't a carpenter who saw the world as a collection of straight lines and right angles. He was a felt maker who understood materials that were flexible, that yielded, that enveloped. He saw the wind not as an enemy to be stopped, but as a current to be navigated. His roundhouse did not present a flat, stubborn face to the gale. It offered a curve. The wind, unable to gain purchase, simply flowed around it, its energy diffused and harmless. He didn't build a wall against the wind. He denied the wind a corner to bite. It is a quiet but powerful statement about the nature of wisdom. True resilience is not always found in strength, but often in the intelligent absence of opposition. It is the wisdom of the reed that bends in the storm while the mighty oak cracks. Wilhelm Funck didn't defeat the Kansas winter. He simply chose not to fight it on its own terms. If you enjoyed this story of quiet ingenuity, please like this video and subscribe for more tales of forgotten history. And let us know in the comments. What modern technology do you think owes a debt to this kind of old-world, practical knowledge? Thanks for watching. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building techniques in a modern context should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.